You're listening to Puma Podcast.
We're talking about families that had 21 years to hide the paper trail, the money trail, all the trails of their crimes, and then flee.
Ako po si Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast for Teka Teka News. And that's Ruben Carranza, a former commissioner of the Presidential Commission on Good Government, or PCGG, the agency tasked with chasing after and recovering billions of dollars worth of the Marcos family's ill-gotten wealth. It has not been easy.
At the end of the day, justices of the Philippine Supreme Court, judges in the Sandigan Bayan, they really have to decide whether they remember what a dictatorship is and understand the absoluteness of the power of a dictator to commit crimes.
It's been a long, tiring, frustrating road, but there have been wins. Ruben walks us through decades-long efforts, how far we've gone, and how far the Philippines is from fully recovering what was stolen. Just last month, in July 2023, the Philippine Supreme Court upheld the decision of the Sandigan Bayan, the country's anti-corruption court, to dismiss a 1 billion peso forfeiture case against the Marcoses, the family of Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the incumbent president, and the son of the late dictator Marcos, and their cronies. When news like this breaks, and there have been a handful of other cases where the Marcoses beat charges against them, many Filipinos read it as injustice, and more worrying, maybe as a trend. Especially with the new Marcos as president, they ask, is this an indicator of how everything else will go from here on? Ruben now works with the International Center for Transitional Justice in New York, but he was a commissioner of the PCGG from 2001 to 2004. He was in charge of litigation and investigation, and he says, it's important for people to be dismayed, but it's also important to remember, in the Filipino people versus the Marcoses, there have also been important wins. In any case, Ruben stresses, on either side of wins and losses, the whole picture is so convoluted, it's actually not that easy to answer the question, are we winning or are we losing?
So the cases are complex and very many, and it will take too long to walk through even some of them. So maybe just focus on 3 or 4 cases that are of such importance that they actually should determine how we see the history of litigation against the Marcoses. So the most important case is a 2003 decision by the Philippine Supreme Court that came out 20 years ago, July 2003. This is a case where the Swiss bank deposits of the Marcoses were involved. The case was filed as a forfeiture case under an old 1955 law that essentially says if a public official's assets are grossly disproportionate to his income, those assets will be presumed ill-gotten. As a footnote, this 1955 law, the forfeiture law, was co-sponsored by Ferdinand Marcos when he was a congressman. Using this 1955 law, the PCGG and the Republic of the Philippines, the government, filed a forfeiture case against the Marcos spouses. Imelda Marcos was a government official as well at one time.
When Marcos the dictator died in 1989, his children, including incumbent Senator Amy Marcos and the current president Bongbong Marcos, were substituted together with their mother Imelda. So the entire surviving Marcos family, as heirs, all became defendants. This case was filed in 1991.
Marcos Jr. actually testified at the anti-corruption court because he wanted to pursue a settlement with the Philippine government, which the PCGG, at least under Heidi Yora, refused to proceed with. So the case went up to the Supreme Court.
It took years, mostly due to tactics and legal maneuvering by the Marcos camp, for the case to make it to the High Tribunal. This part Filipinos already know, and the details for that deserve their own entire episodes. What Ruben would like to underscore at this point is simply what the Marcoses actually submitted in their defense through all those years.
what's important to say is this, that in the entire course of the litigation from the Sandigan Bayan all the way to the Supreme Court, the Marcoses did not present a single piece of paper to counter the allegations and proof presented by the PCGG against them. Not a single piece of paper.
After 2 years of litigation in the Supreme Court, roughly coinciding with Ruben's first 2 years with the PCGG, the justices declared what Ruben calls, quote, very important things, unquote, that would become foundational to all efforts to recover ill-gotten wealth and to hold the Marcoses to account.
Number one, that the legitimate income of the Marcos spouses in the entire 21 years they were in power was only 302,000 US dollars.
That's right, 302,000 US dollars.
The total amount of ill-gotten deposits in Swiss banks in the names of about 14 so-called foundations established by Imelda Marcos, $680 million as of that year, 2003. So under the 1955 law, which says that if a public official's assets are grossly disproportionate to his income, those assets will be presumed ill-gotten. And like I said, the Marcoses never presented a single piece of paper that showed how they acquired $680 million.
Because the Marcoses could not account for that wealth, Ruben says the second thing the Supreme Court said and established was that Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos did, in fact, steal from the Filipino people.
And this is important not just legally, but politically, given all the disinformation that has been going on in the Philippines. The Supreme Court said, and I quote, this money was stolen by the spouses, Marcoses, from the Republic of the Philippines. So it's a very explicit statement of what the Marcoses did and how much the Marcoses stole. What's important about this case is that it isn't just a case that decided that the Swiss bank deposits of the Marcoses is ill-gotten. It's a case that decided that all other assets of the Marcoses, beyond the $302,000 of legitimate income that the Supreme Court found, everything else is ill-gotten.
That 1991 case that Marcos Sr. left with his heirs was so crucial that it led to at least 2 more new cases.
Just a year before I left the PCGG, I filed motions in the Sandigan Bayan that used the 2003 decision as a basis for asking the Sandigan Bayan to rule on all other assets, all other cases involving assets of the Marcoses. So 2 of those cases involve jewelry claimed by Imelda Marcos left behind in Malacanang. So it's called the Malacanang collection of jewelry.
The PCGG currently pegs the value of that jewelry collection at more than 200 million pesos.
And the second is a $50 million deposit in Merrill Lynch, a private bank in New York, in the name of a Marcos Foundation called the Relma, but really having the Marcoses as the beneficiaries, Imelda and the 3 children. So separately, these cases were litigated at the Sandigan Bayan. The motions I prepared were filed. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled, based on the 2003 decision, almost a decade earlier, that the jewelry collection in Malacanang left behind by Imelda Marcos was ill-gotten. Obviously, because it exceeded the value of their legal income of $302,000. In 2017, the Supreme Court again ruled that the Arelma bank account, $50 million as of that year, which probably means it's about $60 million now, is also ill-gotten because it exceeds the legitimate income of the Marcoses.
Of course, when the Marcoses lose in court, it's big news. Philippine governments have been trying to recover billions of dollars in documented stolen assets since Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was ousted by People Power in 1986. When the Marcoses do win in some cases, however, that too is big news. Given the return of a Marcos to the most powerful post in the Philippines, it is arguably a bigger headline. And indeed, the most recent development is what dominates Filipinos' concerns or sense of where the cases currently stand.
Of course, you also have a plethora of ill-gotten wealth cases that involve the Marcoses but were directly filed against Marcos cronies. That's the case that we wanted to discuss, the Tantoco case.
The Tantoco case is indeed what we referred to at the top of this podcast. The Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of a 1 billion peso forfeiture case filed against the Marcoses and their cronies, in this case, the Tantocos of Rustan's fame. Ruben understands the public concern, but he stresses that people could be misled into missing the big picture. It is a picture that, admittedly, started off so big, so ambitious, so complex, with so many elements, that yes, one could get lost in each detail.
The Marcoses and the Marcos cronies were sued by the PCGG in one big case originally in 1987. Just one giant case. And you can imagine how big it is if you were to count how many cronies were actually sued. Maybe there would be about 20, 22 of them.
The Marcos had so many cronies, in fact, that many were simply allowed to settle with the PCGG.
But those who refused to compromise were still sued in one big case. It was the Sandigan Bayan that ordered the PCGG to subdivide the cases. And this is why you have separate cases that were filed against Eduardo Danding Cojuangco involving the Coco Levy and how he used it to acquire San Miguel Corporation, the United Coconut Planters Bank, Coco Life, and other coconut-related assets. This is why you have a separate case against Lucio Tan and Fortune Tobacco and Philippine Airlines, or why you had a separate case against Antonio Tony Boy Cojuangco and PLDT.
As for the Tantoco case,
Civil Case 008, Case number 8, filed against Glyceria and Bienvenido Tantoco. Glyceria, the blue lady, is one of the bluest ladies of Imelda Marcos. The Tantocos were rewarded handsomely for their loyalty to Imelda Marcos.
Ruben says that they were so loyal that Glyceria Tantoco agreed to be the Marcos dummy in the acquisition of 4 tens of million-dollar buildings in Manhattan, the so-called Crown Building on Fifth Avenue, another in Madison Avenue, a mall in Herald Square, and what is now one of the Trump Towers in downtown Manhattan.
Imelda Marcos wanted these as birthday gifts for her. In 1981 to 1982, at that time, Filipino children were dying of malnutrition in Negros because the price of sugar collapsed. And in a province that was completely reliant on exporting sugar, they were dying. Imelda Marcos was busy shopping for skyscrapers in Manhattan, and Glyceria Tantoco was the one who signed those contracts on her behalf. She was so loyal that when the Marcoses fled to the US and the United States prosecutors started investigating Imelda Marcos, they summoned Glyceria Tantoco to provide some statements to them while they were investigating Imelda Marcos. And she pleaded guilty. So she would rather fall for Imelda Marcos as a fall guy, in this case a fall blue lady, than betray her. That's the kind of loyalty that was rewarded by Ferdinand Marcos during the dictatorship.
The problem for Filipinos listening to all of this, of course, is if all this were true, and in fact established, then why was the forfeiture case dismissed?
This is really a case filed against the Tantocos with the Marcoses as co-defendants, and it alleges that the Tantocos were given, among other privileges, 25-year franchise to operate exclusively duty-free shops in the Philippines, paying only a 7% franchise tax on their profits. No income taxes, no corporate taxes, just 7% of whatever profits they declare. But that's not even the worst part yet. This 7% that they were supposed to pay as taxes for the franchise of 25 years, only 2% would go to the government. Where did the 5% go?
The case filed by the PCGG says the 5% went to private foundations headed by Imelda Marcos. In 2019, the Sandigan Bayan said there is not enough evidence on that score. And last month, the High Court agreed.
The Supreme Court said there's no proof that this goes to Imelda Marcos' own foundations. There's no document that was submitted. There's no testimony that was given. I don't know what kind of lawyer you have to be a Supreme Court justice who says that, because the very decree that Ferdinand Marcos signed in 1977, granting this exclusive duty-free franchise to the Tantocos, specifies the foundation to which this 5% goes to. It's the nutrition center of the Philippines. Is it so hard to find out who headed the nutrition center of the Philippines in 1977?
It was Imelda Marcos who sat as chair of the Nutrition Center of the Philippines.
So that's the case. The Sandigan Bayan dismissed that and said, all you submitted were copies of documents, not originals. All you presented were four people to testify, claiming that, as usual in many of these Marcos cases, that, the PCGG submitted photocopies only. Nobody ever bothers to ask, where would the originals be? Nobody ever wonders whether a dictator would flee and neatly leave behind originals in his bedroom for PCGG investigators to discover when they go in. If you give a 25-year franchise to operate duty-free shops, do I need to show you what's wrong with that? Maybe I do, but do you expect me to show you a transcript of the conversation between Imelda Marcos and Gliceria Tantoco, or Ferdinand Marcos and Lucio Tan saying, Lucio, compare, I will give you the privilege of printing your own stamp so you can make money and then give me some of it, which, by the way, is what Marcos Jr. claims. He claims that 60% of the assets of Lucio Tan belong to the Marcos family. He testified to this in the civil case against Lucio Tan. So, what else do you need?
Ruben says it was perhaps inevitable that the hundreds of cases against the Marcoses and their cronies would be divided and tackled separately. But he says it also overwhelmed the public and even media as they try but ultimately fail to track every single development on its own merits, as opposed to appreciating everything with one overarching context. And Ruben frets that it gives the courts a tendency or an excuse to remove or lose sight of that one big argument that should backstop all the cases filed on behalf of the people of the Philippines.
Because now, each case is treated as if it were some completely isolated set of events separate from what happened during the dictatorship.
The Presidential Commission on Good Government, PCGG, was established on February 28, 1986, just 3 days after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship. As Ferdinand Marcos was forced into exile in Hawaii, the PCGG's creation became the very first executive order, EO No. 1, of President Corazon C. Aquino. 37 years later, a few victories of the PCGG has far from meant complete recovery of everything the Marcoses stole. In the same vein, however, Ruben stresses that each setback also does not point to complete collapse of this decades-long effort to get everything back to the Filipino people.
So, recovering ill-gotten wealth, I think there has been significant steps toward that. And the 2003 decision, I think, decisively declares and is a basis for all other efforts to recover assets from the Marcoses.
For every setback, Ruben says it's important to not lose sight of what's been proven, established, won, and actually returned.
If it were just being able to recover assets from the Marcoses, I think that despite long delays in litigation, despite the flaws of the PCGG's efforts, despite reports of corruption within the PCGG itself, being able to get a Supreme Court ruling that says the only assets of the Marcoses really is $302,000 and everything else is ill-gotten, being able to recover $680 million from Switzerland. And I should add, when I was in the PCGG, one of the last things I did was to draft a bill that would set aside $200 million of that $680 million to fund the reparations program for Marcos dictatorship victims. That became a law in 2013, and that was implemented by the end of 2018. That's why you have 11,103 officially recognized victims of the dictatorship. These came from the efforts of the commission, not just our commission, but commissioners before us. I should mention the recovery of San Miguel shares. 24% of San Miguel was recovered. All of the United Coconut Planters Bank was recovered. PLDT shares owned by the government were recovered. There have been a significant number of recoveries. Their line is, if you don't prosecute and convict Imelda Marcos, then you didn't win. But you had a 2018 decision by the Sandigan Bayan convicting Imelda Marcos of the very same acts that led to the deposit of ill-gotten wealth in Switzerland. So the same foundations that she set up to hide $680 million in Switzerland were the same foundations that were involved in her conviction in 2018. So there is, in fact, a criminal conviction against Imelda Marcos that is now on appeal in the Supreme Court.
Despite all that, and beyond the cases, meanwhile, the Marcoses are not only continuing to fight in the courts, they are back in power. I asked Ruben, given precisely his reminder that we cannot take litigation and legalities in a vacuum, given precisely that we cannot take political realities out of what happens in the pursuit of ill-gotten wealth or justice, what might the current Marcos presidency mean to the mandate of the PCGG?
The fact that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president shows that it's not enough to recover ill-gotten wealth. Perhaps it's not even enough to convict Imelda Marcos. Maybe on an optimistic or at least hopeful note, alongside the creation of the PCGG, like I said, in March 1986, a year after that, Filipinos approved a new constitution. That's what we have now, right? The 1987 Constitution. And in one of the final provisions of the Constitution, so-called transitory provisions, they put in one clause that perhaps at that time people knew was significant, but many decades later people forget that it's there. It's a clause that says that efforts to recover ill-gotten wealth are not barred by time. They can be pursued forever against not just the public officials who originally acquired ill-gotten wealth, but also their heirs, their descendants. Not just Marcos, but also Marcos Jr., and not just Marcos Jr., but also the children and grandchildren of Marcos Jr. can be sued to recover ill-gotten wealth that they inherit. There are no deadlines.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Joe Salcedo. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. Follow Teka Teka News on your favorite podcast app, or listen to us for free on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you like this episode, please take the time to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.